Welcome to a series of brief but deep philosophical reflection. My name is Joseph, and I am simply trying to provide critical yet objective commentary on philosophy in order to carefully direct any and all along the path of right reason. This series, entitled Building a Proper Disposition, is dedicated to building a proper philosophical disposition in order to better tackle our abundant philosophical, theological, ethical, and practical dilemmas. What is my fundamental presupposition? That every person attests to his or her own personal beliefs out of some subjectively reasonable circumstance. Thus, I am aiming to illuminate the extent to which our subjective thinking may have become pure bias or even pure error. Remember, there can only be one truth, and this is out of philosophical necessity. Those whose hearts are fixed on reality itself deserve the title of philosophers. Plato. Building a proper disposition. Presentation 1. Recognizing objective reality. The biggest questions that demand exceptional answers are always the most convoluted and profound. What is truth? What is reality? What is purpose? Who or what or even where is the self? We must not be fearful to strive for the answers to such questions, and in this presentation, I will describe our relationship to reality, along with a formidable proposition demonstrating that there must exist an objective reality. As a child, we are dependent on others. We require nourishment, care, and guidance. There is a time where we are completely reliant, but that slowly develops into times where we just might become capable of being relied on, and thus the cycle continues. How natural is this mode of operation? It seems quite natural. Even newly born animals require the instruction or imitation of their own parents in order to fully harness their own nature or identity. Imitation is a form of flattery. One might imitate a role model, a leader, a favorite musician, or an honorable figure. But imitation is also a means by which we form habit and conduct ourselves according to what is present. This is the beginning of recognizing reality for what it is, as well as establishing our own worldview, of it, within it, and about it. Now, why do I introduce this topic of imitation? It seems like a socially constructed mechanism by which the famed or the respected remain influential in our own subjective lives. But is that all that is gained from the element of imitation? If you honestly imitate someone because he or she had an impactful and lasting impression on your being, what does this reveal to us about reality when we attempt confronting those larger-than-life questions previously posited? What is truth? What is reality? Well, if it is naturally understood that imitation of elders serves the newly born animals in their venture through reality, then how different can we proclaim our own potential benefits from doing the exact same activity? If we imitate the natural order by following its example of what has been and will continue to be naturally ordered, then would that not be a naturally reasonable means by which we ourselves are to mature and develop, as well as understand a little bit more of this grand schema or phenomena we call reality? In other words, if we are to really delve into the truths behind reality, I think imitating what is naturally present is a great starting point. It just might teach us something about ourselves that we have been unable to see clearly due to the unnatural constructs proliferated throughout a natural world. Now, what is being proposed here? Am I claiming that we adopt mannerisms relative to the Hobbesian natural chaos where competition and apex mentalities serve to separate the chaff from the wheat? Or am I claiming that a return to more essential and traditional views of natural order be remembered amidst this superficial chaos? Well, I declare the latter is more suitable, that we ought to recognize the natural order for its incorruptible and untainted existence rather than the one we typically subscribe to via common dialectic or biased agenda. This is the greatest and most necessary step in recognizing reality for what it is, that there is a human element present in it today that could not have always been there, such that if we merely view it through a lens of human necessity, we would be deliberately, though perhaps obliviously, blinding ourselves of the objective reality that transcends every human construct. In other words, the natural existence must be seen as superseding our own existence, simply due to it having been prior to us. Now, in this immediate beginning or cosmogony, one can input creation myth, biblical narrative, formal scientific theorems, or form any divine purpose one would like. But the purpose of this initial step is not to establish correlation between subjective conclusion and objective truth, but rather to ground ourselves in what is undoubtedly present and known via sense data and reasoned by reflecting on times past. In other words, objective reality exists. This must be a fact, independent of our subjective analyses, dispositions, and ideas. Why must it be a fact? Because out of the necessary causal relationship we each share with reality itself. We are all dependent on it, being such that we cannot claim that our own subjective emanations play any role in its own existence. And it must be true that any dependent effect must necessarily rely on an independent cause. In other words, in order to recognize reality for what it is, we must understand our own relationship to it. And in every regression model or system that one can contemplate, there can never, definitively, be a case where our existence independently yielded or caused a dependent reality. Therefore, by being independent of our own subjective inquiry, observation, or even existence, we must necessarily conclude that in the least, an objective reality does exist, one that is independent of us, and is necessarily categorically equivalent to a first principle. Analogously, this is very similar to our own mode of procreation, that we are each dependent on a necessary cause, which is our parents. This is why forming a proper disposition, I'll exclude qualifiers such as social, religious, or any others for now, but simply a singular proper disposition is so important. It is the very ground and foundation on which all else will become scrutinized, questioned, and ultimately accepted or rejected. And if we are unable to properly recognize this preeminent causal relationship between our dependent subjective existence and an independent objective reality, then there is absolutely no reasonable means by which any individual can contemplate, imagine, think, or even act in accordance with that which is naturally ordered. It is literally impossible, because some portion or category that is subservient to the independent cause would most likely become irrationally elevated above such independent or objective reality. In other words, the entire scope and focus of one who deviates far from this necessary causal relationship will only succeed in successively compounded error. This is the severity and significance of recognizing objective reality for what it is, not only in concept, but in its own necessary existence. From this basic foundation, that we are dependent on reality, thus our limitations deem it necessary to conclude that our subjective existence is dependent on some independent cause, we can then learn from it. We can imitate it. We can develop into what it is rightfully and appropriately relative to our being and reality itself. For the contentious types who want to view this as an ontological argument for God, or even for the predisposed theists who might claim this as pantheistic rhetoric, or even the stern physicist who wants to redefine first principle or objective reality to some theorized narrative. Yes, yes, and yes, you are all correct. That is the testament of such an articulation, that I'm not proposing anything relative to subjective interpretation nor preconceived bias. Instead, I am demonstrating the necessary relationship between us as humanity and that which simply is. And because of this impartial and seemingly objective stance, it in itself can become scrutinized by any and all subjective criteria or definitions one wants to further propose. But alas, it will still remain that out of necessity, this causal relationship not only exists, but is true. Whereas perhaps out of desire, any of your proposals just might stick as well. To anyone who denies an objective reality, please, I implore you to recognize the potential biases present in your unsound reasoning. I am sure reasonable propositions and claims can be and have been made in opposition to objective reality, such as flux or the concept of change, radical idealism, or the limited perceptions inherently caused by a reality merely made apparent. But all of these are in their very essence emanations from our continuously processed rationalizations. They are dependent on our own interpretations rather than we being dependent on that which simply and purely is. Thus, these types of positions further demonstrate my description of subjective and dependent forms irrationally being elevated above that which must necessarily exist. I will conclude by repeating the significance of recognizing an objective reality as part of your disposition. Without this formal necessity, divergent error and irrational justification would slowly become the foundation on which all proceeding formulations would be contingent. It is anthropologically expected to be humbled in the face of such a question as, what is reality? But it is more philosophically honest to account for this humility in one's own initial and developing disposition in order to strive towards contemplating or answering such. In fact, it is realistically necessary. You've made it to the end. Let's recap. I introduced a simple analogy of the young imitating elders and compared this to how our humanity is capable of imitating that which has come before it, namely, pre-existent natural order that has been untainted by human modification or social construct. Then I postulated the philosophical necessity for acknowledging an objective reality exists, and proposed reason for firmly grounding oneself in this disposition, the primary reason being that with this disposition one can clearly see that there is definitive rightness or wrongness in all that we do, whether ethically, socially, personally, and even culturally. Because an objective reality exists, it means that we should strive for perfection in it by correlating our subjective existences with that which has independently and objectively been. This culminates in the singular motto, there can only be one truth, and that's a fact.